The days that followed felt like a strange dream to Caleb. The land stretched before him, vast and silent, yet the presence of Aiyana lingered in his mind, like the scent of sage carried by the wind. He had tried to go back to his solitary life, his routine of riding through the desert, repairing fences, and checking the cattle. But something was different now. It was as if the quiet he once sought had become unbearable. He couldn't stop thinking about her defiant gaze, her calm authority, and the way she had stood her ground, despite all the forces that would have torn her down. Caleb knew he wasn't the kind of man who usually fought for anything. His life had been about survival, about putting one foot in front of the other and getting by. But in Aiyana's eyes, he saw something worth fighting for. He couldn't explain it. He only knew that every time he thought of her, he felt something stirring inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. One morning, as Caleb rode his horse along the edge of the canyon, he saw her again. She was standing by a group of her people, the Apache warriors. They were gathered near the edge of the river, their movements deliberate, their faces stoic. Aiyana stood in the center, her long black hair blowing in the wind, her arms crossed over her chest. She seemed to be giving orders, speaking in the soft, rhythmic cadence of her native language. Caleb knew he shouldn't approach. He had no right to be there, no reason to interfere with their lives. But as he watched, something inside him urged him to go. He couldn't just walk away anymore. He rode closer, slowly, his heart beating a little faster with each step. When Aiyana turned and saw him, her expression softened. For a moment, there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes, followed by a hint of annoyance. But then, just as quickly, the hardness returned, and she crossed her arms once more. Caleb didn't know what to say, so he simply dismounted and walked toward her. The warriors watched him closely, their eyes narrow and calculating. Aiyana, however, didn't look away. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly, her voice still carrying the strength it had before. "I know," Caleb replied, his voice steady. "But I couldn't stay away." Aiyana raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his admission. "Why?" she asked, the single word cutting through the air like a sharp knife. Caleb paused for a moment, trying to find the right words. "Because," he began, "I want to understand. I want to understand you, your people, everything." Aiyana looked at him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. She didn't speak, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something Caleb couldn't quite place. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "You don't understand," she said. "You can't. You're not one of us." Caleb's heart sank at her words, but he refused to back down. "I know I'm not," he said quietly, "but I want to try. I'm not asking you to accept me. I just want to help." Aiyana studied him for a moment, and then, as if making a decision, she nodded. "We don't need help," she said, her voice firm. "But we might need someone to watch our backs." Caleb was taken aback by her words. "Watch your backs," he repeated, confused. Aiyana glanced around at the warriors who were still watching them, their eyes flicking back and forth between the two of them. "There's a threat coming," she said, her tone serious. "A group of men who want to take what's ours. They'll stop at nothing to get it." Caleb's heart began to race. "What can I do?" he asked, stepping closer. "Help me protect my people," Aiyana said, her gaze locking with his. "And maybe, just maybe, you'll prove that you're worth more than the land you came from." Caleb didn't hesitate. He knew there was no going back now. "I'm in," he said, his voice low and determined. And just like that, Caleb found himself at the beginning of something he had never expected, a journey that would take him far beyond the land he knew, a journey that would challenge everything he thought he believed, and a journey that would ultimately bring him closer to the woman who had unknowingly captured his heart. The days blurred together as Caleb found himself thrust into a world he never expected to be a part of. Every morning, he woke to the sound of the wind sweeping across the plains, the distant calls of birds, and the steady rhythm of hooves on the hard-packed earth. Aiyana had kept her word. She let him stay. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. But it wasn't easy. The Apache warriors were cautious, always watching him with wary eyes, unsure of his intentions. Yet, with each passing day, Caleb proved his loyalty not through words, but through action. He worked alongside them, helping build fortifications, learning their ways, and slowly earning their respect. Aiyana, however, remained distant. she never fully warmed to him, keeping their interactions brief and guarded. Yet Caleb could see the subtle shifts, the way she would glance at him from across the campfire, the slight tilt of her head when he spoke. There was something there, something unspoken. But the threat Aiyana had warned him about loomed over them like a dark cloud. Rumors of a group of settlers, driven by greed, began to spread. They were taking more than land. They were taking lives. Caleb had heard whispers about men who wanted to stake a claim on Apache territory, men who didn't care about the people who lived there. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about survival. One evening, as Caleb sat by the fire, Aiyana approached him. She didn't speak at first, just stood there in silence, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. Caleb looked up at her, his heart pounding a little faster than usual. "I'm glad you're here," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, surprised by the softness in her tone. "I'm here to help," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know," Aiyana said, her eyes meeting his. "But help is more than just fighting. It's about understanding. It's about protecting what matters." Caleb nodded, unsure of what she meant, but feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. The next day, they rode out together. The air was cool, the sun just beginning to rise over the distant hills. Aiyana led the way, her horse moving with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. Caleb followed closely behind, feeling both nervous and exhilarated. They reached the border of the Apache lands just as the sun hit its peak. The land here was dry, the earth cracked and barren in places, but it was still beautiful in its own way, rugged and wild, just like the people who called it home. Aiyana dismounted and surveyed the area. "This is where they'll come," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet urgency. "They'll try to take this land, and they won't stop until they do." Caleb nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice low. Aiyana turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You can stay," she said, "and fight with us." Caleb's heart clenched at her words. He wasn't just fighting for her anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something that didn't belong to him, but that he was willing to defend with everything he had. As the day wore on, they made plans, how to prepare, where to set traps, how to protect the women and children. Caleb listened intently, following Aiyana's lead, knowing that the coming days would test him in ways he hadn't imagined. The sun dipped below the horizon, and Caleb found himself alone for a moment, his thoughts drifting to the woman who had changed his life. He had come here for reasons he couldn't fully explain, but now, standing at the edge of a fight he wasn't sure he could win, he realized something. He wasn't just fighting for Aiyana or her people. He was fighting for his own future, for the chance to build something that was worth fighting for. He had never believed in fate, but now, he wasn't so sure. As the stars began to dip the sky, Caleb looked up, knowing that whatever happened next, he was ready. And maybe, just maybe, this was where he truly belonged. The days passed in a blur of preparation. Caleb found himself constantly moving, either working alongside the Apache warriors, helping fortify their position, or learning more about their ways. The bonds between them were slowly strengthening, but the tension in the air remained. They knew the settlers would come soon, but they didn't know when. Each day, as Caleb rode through the camp, he could see the worry in the faces of the women, the children, and even the men who were usually so sure of themselves. Aiyana had not said much since their last conversation, but her presence was a constant. She was always near, her eyes always watching him. Caleb could feel the weight of her gaze, even when she wasn't looking directly at him. It was as if she was weighing him, trying to figure out if he was truly someone she could trust. As the sun began to set one evening, casting long shadows across the camp, Aiyana approached Caleb once again. This time, there was no hesitation in her step. She didn't wait for him to speak first. "You've been here long enough now," she said, her voice steady. Caleb looked up at her, his heart quickening a little. "What do you mean?" he asked. Aiyana glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. Then, her gaze locked onto his. "You've earned the right to know what we're up against. We're not just fighting for land. We're fighting for everything we've ever known. For our way of life, for our people." Caleb nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm with you. Whatever comes, I'll fight beside you." Aiyana studied him for a moment, her face unreadable. "Good," she said simply, and then turned to walk away. Caleb watched her go, feeling a surge of something he hadn't expected, pride. Aiyana was a leader, strong and resolute, and yet she had allowed him into her world. In her own way, she had trusted him. But the question still lingered in his mind. Did he truly belong here, among these people who had lived for generations on this land? Was his place truly at her side, or was he simply an outsider, trying to be something he wasn't? That night, as Caleb lay beneath the stars, the sounds of the camp faded into the background. His thoughts drifted back to the first day he had met Aiyana, the way her eyes had held so much of the world in them, how she had made him feel like an intruder and yet, somehow, invited him in. What had started as a simple act of survival had grown into something more, something he couldn't quite define. As he lay there, staring up at the vast expanse of sky, Caleb knew that he would not back down. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges they faced, he would fight for Aiyana and her people, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was starting to understand what it meant to truly belong. The next morning, Caleb rode out with the Apache warriors once again. The sun was just rising, casting a golden hue over the land. Aiyana rode beside him, her presence like a silent promise. As they neared the edge of their territory, Caleb felt the tension rise in the air, like the calm before a storm. It was only a matter of time before the settlers made their move, and Caleb was ready. He had no illusions about the battle ahead. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But as he looked at Aiyana, her eyes fixed on the horizon, he knew that whatever came their way, they would face it together. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day. And now, more than ever, Caleb knew he was ready to fight for her people, and for the land they called home. The days leading up to the confrontation were filled with an unspoken tension. Caleb could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. The Apache camp was bustling with preparation, men sharpening weapons, women gathering supplies, and children staying close to their mothers, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Aiyana moved through it all with the same quiet strength that Caleb had come to admire. She was a leader, but there was something more to her than just that. There was a deep, unyielding resolve in her eyes that spoke of a life lived on the edge, of a people who had survived against all odds. Caleb found himself watching her more and more, trying to read the unspoken language in the way she moved, in the way she spoke, in the way she led her people. He had never thought of himself as a leader, but standing by her side, he felt like he was becoming something more, something worth fighting for. One morning, as the sun crested the horizon, Caleb rode out with Aiyana and the warriors. They had been riding for hours, the land stretching endlessly before them, when they spotted the first signs of trouble. A group of settlers had crossed the line, pushing into Apache territory, as they had feared. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. Aiyana pulled her horse to a stop, her eyes scanning the distance, her face unreadable. Caleb waited beside her, his own thoughts racing. He had known this day would come, but now that it was here, he felt the weight of it settle over him like a heavy cloak. Aiyana turned to him, her expression softening for just a moment. "Stay close," she said, her voice low but firm. Caleb nodded, the words of her command sinking in. "I will," he said, his voice steady. They rode forward together, the warriors falling into formation behind them. As they neared the settlers' camp, the tension was palpable. Caleb could hear the clink of metal as the Apache warriors adjusted their weapons, preparing for the inevitable. He knew the stakes. This wasn't just a fight for land. It was a fight for their way of life, for everything that Aiyana and her people held dear. The settlers were close now, and Caleb could see the outlines of their tents in the distance. His grip tightened on the reins, his body tense with anticipation. He wasn't just here to fight for Aiyana anymore. He was here to fight for all of them. Aiyana led the way, her presence a steady force in the midst of the storm. Caleb followed her, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. They stopped just at the edge of the camp, the settlers unaware of their presence for the moment. Aiyana turned to Caleb, her eyes meeting his. "When the time comes," she said, "you'll have to choose. But no matter what happens, remember why you're here." Caleb didn't answer right away. He had already made his choice. "I'm here because I believe in this," he said, his voice quiet but certain. Aiyana nodded, a slight flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't just approval. It was something deeper, something that told Caleb he wasn't just another outsider anymore. He was part of this. He was part of her world. As the first rays of sunlight hit the camp, the settlers finally noticed them, and the tension broke. The leader of the settlers, a tall man with a weathered face and a cold look in his eyes, stepped forward. "You've crossed the line," he shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. "This land is ours now." Aiyana didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her voice. "This land has never been yours," she replied calmly, her words carrying more weight than any weapon. Caleb felt a surge of pride. He wasn't just standing beside Aiyana as a protector anymore. He was standing with her, an equal. The leader of the settlers took a step forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "You're making a mistake," he warned. But Aiyana didn't hesitate. She looked at Caleb, her expression resolute, and then she turned back to the settlers. "No," she said simply. "The mistake was yours the moment you stepped onto this land." The settlers shifted, their hands moving toward their weapons, but Caleb didn't move. Neither did Aiyana. This was it. There was no turning back now. The air was thick with the tension of what was to come. Caleb stood by Aiyana, his body poised and ready, though his mind raced. The settlers had not retreated. They were still there, their hands inching toward their weapons, their leader's expression cold and determined. But Aiyana remained calm, her eyes steady as she looked back at Caleb, giving him a silent assurance that, no matter what, they would face this together. Caleb couldn't deny the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a fight for land anymore. It was a fight for something bigger, a fight for a way of life that had existed long before him, long before any of them. He could feel the weight of that responsibility settle over him. He wasn't just standing there to protect Aiyana. He was standing to protect the Apache people, their culture, their history. The leader of the settlers took another step forward, his voice rising. "This is our land now. You can't keep us out. We've already claimed it." Aiyana didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she straightened her back, her voice as firm and unwavering as the land she stood on. "This land has never been yours to claim," she said, her words carrying across the field, cutting through the heated air. "It belongs to the Apache, and we will fight to protect it." Caleb felt his heart beat a little faster as the words settled in. It wasn't just Aiyana's words, it was the truth. This was their land. They had always been here. And he was standing by her, standing with them, not as an outsider, but as someone who believed in their right to live free on their own terms. The settler leader's face twisted with frustration. He looked over at his men, who were still trying to decide if they should draw their weapons. There was a flicker of hesitation in the air, but the leader's eyes burned with determination. He raised his hand and gave a sharp gesture. Caleb could hear the warriors behind him readying themselves, their horses shifting beneath them. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. Caleb felt Aiyana's presence next to him, her calm steadiness anchoring him. He wasn't just fighting for her anymore. He wasn't just fighting for the Apache people. He was fighting for something inside himself, something he had found in the stillness of the desert, in the way Aiyana had looked at him, in the way they had come to understand each other without words. It wasn't about the fight itself anymore. It was about what came after. It was about the future they could have if they held their ground. Caleb clenched his jaw, his grip on his reins tightening. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew this was a turning point. This was the moment where everything changed. The leader of the settlers stepped forward again, his voice now a low, threatening growl. "You'll regret this," he said, his eyes narrowing. But Aiyana didn't flinch. She held his gaze without a hint of fear. "I regret nothing," she said quietly, and it was then that Caleb realized she wasn't just standing up for her people. She was standing up for everything she believed in. She wasn't afraid, and neither was he. The two of them stood there together, facing the settlers, facing what was to come. Caleb knew that no matter what happened next, he had made the right choice. And as the sun sank lower, painting the sky with streaks of red and orange, he felt something stirred deep within him. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The settlers hesitated, their leader's eyes flickering with uncertainty. Caleb could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on him. Aiyana stood firm beside him, her gaze unwavering, her body ready. The tension in the air was thick, but Caleb's mind was clear. This was no longer just about standing in front of Aiyana. It was about standing for everything that was right. The leader of the settlers, seeing his men still unsure, let out a sharp command. The air seemed to snap with energy as the men began to move. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. But he remained steady. He knew what was coming, and he knew he had a role to play. Aiyana turned to him, her eyes meeting his for just a moment. Her expression was calm, but Caleb could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had burned in her when she had first led them all into this stand. "Remember what we stand for," she said, her voice soft but strong. "Not just the land. The people. Our future." Caleb nodded, his heart swelling with pride. He wasn't just fighting for the land anymore. He was fighting for a future where Aiyana's people could live without fear, without oppression. The settlers moved closer, their hands tightening on their weapons, but still, Aiyana held her ground. "This land doesn't belong to you," she said, her voice steady and clear. "And you will not take it from us." The leader of the settlers sneered, his face contorted with anger. "You're a fool," he spat. "You can't protect what doesn't belong to you. We'll take what we want, and you can't stop us." Aiyana's eyes flashed with something more dangerous than anger. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she said, her voice lowering, a sharp edge in it now. Caleb felt his pulse quicken as the settlers closed in, but he remained still, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, ready for whatever would come next. In that moment, everything seemed to slow. The sounds of the camp, the rustling of the wind, the soft thud of hooves in the dirt, faded away as Caleb's focus sharpened. He was no longer just an outsider standing beside Aiyana. He was part of something bigger, part of a battle for what was right. The leader of the settlers took another step forward, his voice rising. "We've been patient," he shouted. "But now it's time for you to step aside." Caleb's heart thudded in his chest as the words hit him. This was the moment. He wasn't sure what the next few minutes would bring, but he knew one thing. He wasn't backing down. Aiyana stood beside him, unwavering. Her strength, her resolve, it all centered in that one moment. They weren't just fighting for a piece of land. They were fighting for a chance to live on their own terms, for the future of their people, for the legacy of the Apache. Caleb glanced at her one last time, his heart full of admiration for the woman who had led them all to this point. He wasn't just following her anymore. He was fighting alongside her. And in that, he had found his purpose. As the first settler lunged forward, the rest of the men followed suit, but it wasn't chaos. It was controlled, calculated, as if everything had been leading up to this single moment. Aiyana and Caleb, side by side, stood ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would protect what mattered. Caleb's hand tightened on his weapon, his breath steady, his resolve unshaken. The fight for their future had just begun. The settlers moved forward with determined steps, but the Apache warriors were ready. Aiyana stood tall, her gaze never leaving the leader of the group, her stance as unwavering as the land she fought for. Caleb felt the pull of the moment, the tension thick in the air. The world around him seemed to slow, the only sounds the whisper of the wind and the soft thud of hooves beneath them. The leader of the settlers raised his hand once more, signaling his men to advance. "We won't back down," he declared, his voice carrying over the field. "Not now, not ever." But Aiyana's voice was calm, cutting through his words like a sharp blade. "You've made your choice," she said, her eyes locked with his. "And now you will face the consequences." Caleb stood beside her, his heart steady, his resolve clear. This was more than just a battle. It was a fight for something greater than land or power. It was a fight for freedom, for dignity, for the chance to live without fear. He wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't back down. As the settlers took another step forward, Caleb's pulse quickened. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This was about something that mattered more than survival. This was about standing for what was right, no matter the cost. Aiyana gave him a brief glance, her expression unreadable, but there was a spark of something in her eyes, a quiet strength that told him they would face this together. The leader of the settlers sneered, his eyes filled with disdain. "You think you can stop us?" he spat, his voice thick with anger. "You can't hold us back forever." Aiyana didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her voice. "We don't need to stop you," she replied, her words simple but filled with power. "We just need to stand our ground." Caleb felt a surge of pride in her words. She wasn't just defending her people, she was defending everything they believed in. She was defending their right to live as they had always lived, free and unbowed. The settlers hesitated, their eyes shifting between one another. The tension in the air was palpable, but Aiyana didn't give them the chance to regroup. She turned to Caleb, her voice steady as she spoke. "Stay close," she said softly. Caleb nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm with you," he replied. And he meant it. As the settlers moved forward again, Aiyana and Caleb stood their ground, ready to face whatever came next. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the earth and the promise of something greater. Caleb could feel the weight of history pressing on him, the weight of the land, the weight of Aiyana's people, the weight of the future they were fighting for. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what happened, he had made the right choice. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Aiyana turned back to face the settlers, her eyes cold and determined. "This land is ours," she said quietly, "and we will not let you take it." The leader of the settlers took a step back, his face darkening with frustration. But Aiyana didn't waver. She stood like a mountain, unshaken, unyielding. Caleb could see the strength in her, the power that came from deep within her spirit, from the generations of Apache who had lived and died for this land. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the very soul of her people. And Caleb was with her every step of the way. The settlers, for the first time, looked uncertain. They had come with their guns, their threats, their sense of entitlement, but they hadn't counted on Aiyana's strength. They hadn't counted on Caleb standing beside her. They hadn't counted on the power of what they were fighting for. The leader of the settlers took a step back, his expression faltering, as though realizing the depth of the resolve. Standing before him, "You'll regret this," he muttered, his voice low. But Aiyana didn't flinch. "No," she said simply. "You already have." And with that, the settlers, for the first time, realized they weren't the ones who held the power. They were the ones who would have to retreat. Caleb felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by something stronger. It wasn't over yet. But today, they had won something more than just a battle. They had won a future. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Something worth fighting for. The days after the confrontation felt like a shift in the very air they breathed. Caleb could feel the change, like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The settlers had left, retreating with their heads low, their pride shattered. The Apache people, on the other hand, stood tall, their spirits renewed, their land defended. Aiyana didn't say much in the days that followed, but her presence was enough. Caleb could sense the weight of everything she carried, the responsibility for her people, the pressure of being their leader, the burden of protecting a way of life that had endured for generations. Yet, despite it all, she remained calm, her eyes steady as ever. Caleb knew that the battle they had won wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The settlers had left, but there were others out there, others who might try to take what didn't belong to them. And Aiyana knew this as well as he did. As they stood together one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Caleb finally spoke. "What now?" he asked quietly, not really expecting an answer, but needing to ask anyway. Aiyana looked at him, her face softening for a moment. "We keep living," she said simply. "We keep fighting for what's ours. For the future." Caleb nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest. It wasn't over, and it never would be. But they had made it through this time. And that was something. Over the next few weeks, Caleb continued to work alongside Aiyana and the others, strengthening the bonds between them. The Apache people had always been a family, but now, Caleb was part of that family. He had earned their respect, not through words, but through action, through standing with them when it mattered most. And in return, they had shown him a world he never thought he would understand. The relationship between him and Aiyana had changed too. It wasn't just about the battle anymore. It was about something deeper, something that neither of them had expected when they first met. They didn't need to speak it aloud. It was there, in the way they moved together, in the way they looked at each other. It was a quiet understanding, a bond formed not from words, but from shared experience. As time passed, Caleb found himself feeling more and more like he belonged. The land that had once felt so foreign to him now felt like home. The people who had once seemed so different from him now felt like family. And Aiyana, The woman who had shown him a new way of seeing the world had become more than just a leader to him. She had become someone he could rely on, someone he could stand beside, not as an outsider, but as a partner. One evening, as the stars began to twinkle above, Aiyana and Caleb stood together by the fire. The camp was quiet, the warriors resting after a long day of work, the women and children nestled in their tents. Aiyana looked up at the stars, her expression thoughtful. Caleb watched her, waiting for her to speak. When she did, her voice was soft, almost wistful. "I used to think that I was the only one who could protect my people," she said, her eyes still on the sky. "That it was my burden to carry alone." Caleb didn't answer right away. He simply stood beside her, letting her words hang in the air. "But now, I see that we're stronger together," she continued, turning to face him. "We all have a part to play in this, and I don't have to do it alone anymore." Caleb felt something stir in him at her words, a deep sense of pride, but also something more, something that told him this was where he was meant to be. "You're not alone," he said softly, his voice steady. Aiyana met his gaze, her eyes holding a depth that spoke more than words ever could. In that moment, Caleb knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. He had found his place, not just in the world, but in her world. And for the first time in his life, Caleb felt at peace. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. Together, they would face whatever came their way, and whatever it was, they would be ready. In this gripping tale of Western stories, a cowboy seeking solitude finds himself drawn into a battle for justice and survival when he crosses paths with a strong Apache woman. As tensions rise with settlers looking to claim the land, their bond grows, and together, they fight to protect her people's way of life. As the cowboy learns the meaning of loyalty and strength, he discovers that his place is not just with his own kind, but standing side by side with the Apache woman who has become his partner. The story is rich with themes of unity, courage, and resilience, capturing the essence of Western stories that explore the clash of cultures and the power of standing together for what is right. Through each challenge and moment of uncertainty, the cowboy and the Apache woman forge a powerful connection, facing their adversaries with unwavering resolve. These Western stories highlight the deep emotions, struggles, and triumphs of individuals who fight not only for land, but for a future, for belonging, and for the people they love. As the story unfolds, the cowboy and the Apache woman's journey becomes one of mutual respect and shared purpose, showing the transformative power of connection in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness of the American West, offering a fresh take on the Western stories genre.